This is part two on our chapter on liberation theologies. So if you remember from a previous slide, one of the things that we looked at that was kind of interesting with liberation theology is that the religion that it started with, Roman Catholicism, is often seen as, ended up being rejected by that same religion. So, for example, particularly from the highest levels of that church hierarchy, we see people going in the other direction, away from liberation theology. So one of the things, I think it makes sense if you think about it, that there's this sort of conflict with European theology. So if you remember that liberation theology got its start in Latin America and has since moved or spread to Asia, Africa, and other developing places, that it makes sense if you think about that folks in those areas would say, when they look at European theology, they say, look, that sort of ignores or seems opposed in certain ways to the concerns of the poor and minorities. So if you think about the epicenter of the Roman Catholic Church, Vatican City there in the middle of Rome, right? It's a lot of money there. It's a lot of opulence. The cardinals, wearing their fancy robes, and the Pope, all these type of things, which might seem very much at odds with, say, for example, Catholics in very poor Latin American countries that don't even have enough to eat or running water, these type of things. So you could see that sort of conflict that developed there. And as this one scholar, Belsaria, says, he says, we find that many elements in the Christian teachings just aren't relevant to us or not relevant to us. So you can see where they have a little bit of a different idea there. And at the bottom, you can see here, so people in Latin America and increasingly elsewhere saw this European theology. They identified that more with the rich and powerful, not the poor and oppressed that they felt that they were. So I've mentioned this phrase before. So one of the founding sort of phrases of liberation theology, and this key concern, is this preferential option for the poor. So it's not just looking at sort of the religious aspect, but also the economic aspect there, right? So there, where someone's financial status or socioeconomic status is a key concern here, and again, the option should be, or the preference should be, more towards that direction. So related to liberation theology, we have this important concept here called base communities, which is just a simple way of saying these kind of community-based organizations. And I think your chapter does a nice job talking about how, say, for example, in a remote village somewhere in Latin America, that they might not even have access to an actual priest or someone who has been trained by the Catholic Church, for example. So a lot of times in those communities, they kind of had to do things for themselves. Sort of appoint someone to be the religious leader. Have someone. People trying to do the best they could in different organizations, right? So base communities is an important aspect here. But even we see in some of the more developed countries, say France, for example, we have this example. It's called the French worker priest movement, where priests were encouraged, were strongly encouraged to work in sort of very sort of low level, sort of difficult, kind of manual labor type jobs, because the idea was, well, you need to sort of identify with your flock, again, and not be all high and mighty, but really kind of get down there in the trenches with the kind of average Joes. But again, we've seen where maybe the sort of more conservative religious hierarchy was opposed to some of those ideas, like the worker priest movement. So I want you to be aware of this concept here we refer to as Vatican II. So again, it might seem a little strange in that this is this sort of council that emphasized modernizing the church back in the early 1960s there. But again, people say, well, that modernization only went so far. But Vatican II, if you remember, we were talking about this transition sort of from Pope John Paul. So remember, he was Pope from 1978 all the way through 2005. So some of the things that were sort of set up, about 10 years or so, 10, 15 years before he entered the papacy, he would later continue some of those Vatican II concepts. So sometimes, as we've seen, not just with liberation theology here, but some of the other political ideologies you've looked at in the course, is that sometimes we see strange bedfellows, for example, where you might see someone from one ideology take elements from another ideology that you might not necessarily think would fit together. So this would be another example of this. You can see Marxist Christian dialogue, right? So if you think about the heyday of the Cold War, this sort of Christian United States saw itself as fundamentally opposed to the largely atheist or early agnostic, at least, Soviet Union. So again, Marxism and Christianity usually have been seen as kind of totally separate things. You wouldn't normally think those go together. But if we look at liberation theology here, this one author says, that the Christianity has this kind of radical potential, right? The sort of the bringing liberation, bringing happiness and the faith and all that to the poor masses. Although on the other hand, some theologians you can see here thought, so again, sorry to emphasize that some theologians thought this emphasis on the poor also fit with that Christian concern for the poor. So again, areas of common ground, things that Marxists may be also looking at, could be the same thing for Christian, both clergy and scholars and so forth. All right. Although on the other hand, to finish this slide up, people did say, well, Marx can be seen as limited because he rejects God, right? So, saying, well, there might be some elements of Marxism there, but can't go the full, all the way there. So here's another term here. Again, it's a little bit of a tongue twister here. Conscientization, right? So this is very similar to this concept called consciousness raising that we've had in other chapters, say feminism, for example, where one of the first things we're looking at often with ideology and social structures, that type of thing, is the idea that the oppressed need to become aware of their oppression if they're going to do anything about it. So sometimes, there might be an instance where, maybe a certain group of people, they don't know any different, because they've been born and raised and sort of socialized into a certain system. And part of the conscientization or consciousness raising idea is to sort of make them aware of other possibilities, another way of life. So as we've mentioned here, so most conservatives within the Roman Catholic Church do reject that liberation theology, which again is interesting because that's the church in which it started. So we wouldn't necessarily think that would be the case. So although we could say that probably has had a lot to do with liberation theology moving from Catholicism towards Protestantism. So again, particularly in Africa and Asia and elsewhere, the Protestant churches have sort of taken up the mantle of liberation theology much more than Catholicism. All right, so here's your core principles here. So these are also listed out in your textbook here. So we have these 6 main principles. So again, you can see it's all sort of related to the poor, or someone with a sort of more of a lower socioeconomic status. So we have these major concerns: so poverty, political and economic repression, and this idea that priests should be actively involved in trying to solve these problems. So not just a religious figure, but an active sort of political person. Again, like an elected official would be, trying to get things done for the poor people. So again, priests should move beyond just general activity, direct political action, direct involvement in trying to change the system. And as we mentioned, this concept earlier of base communities need to be established. So religious folks would obviously be those that are trained, by the sort of major normal church hierarchy. And then lay people would just be, again, people in that community. So you can see the ones that I've put an asterisk next here. Your book mentions that some of these, say this one, for example, number 5, priests should move beyond general activity, that's been flat out rejected, for example, by the church hierarchy, because they don't really want their priests. They say they should stay as a sort of neutral um, religious figure, not a political figure. So same with this, economic repression. So we think about, particularly in Latin America, in a lot of those countries, we see huge inequality. We see a huge inequality gap where there's a very small percentage of very, very rich people. Again, very rich, at least compared to the huge poor masses in some of those countries. So then again, like other ideologies we've looked at, you can see liberation theology has some kind of core principles that, say if it's in a country in Africa or Latin America or whatever, these would be important aspects of it. Now, of course, now that it's moved more to Protestant liberation theology, we could say that, of course, you wouldn't have priests, be more preachers, pastors, whatever you want to refer to them as. All right, so here's a figure that I'd like you to know. So this priest, Gustavo Gutierrez, he wrote this book, Theology of Liberation, back in the early 70s. So he's often seen as the father of liberation theology, or the founder at least. So he's from Peru, and he's currently a professor at the University of Notre Dame up in Indiana, right? A sort of very well-known Catholic institution. All right. So, part of what he says in his book here is this: active, effective participation in the struggle which the exploited social classes have undertaken against their oppressors. Right. So again, we have that sort of dynamic between the oppressed and the oppressor. So that's something that Gutierrez really wanted to focus on. So he stressed consciousness raising, and again, as a priest, he said, look, liberation theology is first and foremost a theology. The message is found on the mission of Christ. So that's why we see that it's different than, again, it's not liberation ideology, it's liberation theology. Now, in a lot of ways, those might overlap in some ways, particularly when we introduce, right? So with liberation theology, we're kind of introducing the political element to it as well. Saying things like you have to be concerned with the poor. Priests or other religious figures should, be more active instead of just sort of passive religious figures, that type of thing. All right, continuing with some core principles here. So this is another important figure with respect to liberation theology. So St. Francis of Assisi. So you can see I've put a, kind of a common depiction of here over on the right. He's usually seen with animals, again, to kind of stress his sort of oneness with nature, his connection to nature. So he insisted on just absolute poverty of his followers. So again, that was sort of seen as heretical at the time, and the more established sort of, church establishment was not exactly so thrilled with his idea or his insistence on the absolute poverty of his followers. So thinking about the current pope, so Pope Francis I, that a lot of people see that, or sort of argued that St. Francis of Assisi has been a major inspiration for Pope Francis I. So we see some things like Pope Francis has refused to live in kind of the huge papal apartment, these type of things. He has more like a small little area. He gets driven around like a regular little car. He doesn't take the real big fancy limousines and these type of things. He's washed the feet of some prisoners, things like that. Stuff that we really wouldn't necessarily have expected other popes to do. So again, you can see some of that influence there with Pope Francis. So the point here is that liberation theology say, that type of poverty, that commitment to the poor and the oppressed, that should be honored, not something to be rejected. So the last part here, return to this base community's idea. So, part of it also was that, thinking about poor people, how to help them in their station in life, is that through consciousness raising, they could help provide this setting where folks could become more self-sufficient and in control of their own lives, instead of being dependent on outsiders. So we'll finish here.